Welcome back. You've made it to the camera settings section of this course. Something that I've noticed in my years as a photographer is a lot of people go a very long time taking photographs without even knowing how or why it looked good or didn't look good. This is because if you're shooting in automatic, you can just snap pictures and let your camera do the work. Sounds great, right? Well, unfortunately, it isn't that easy because if you do this, your images will be all over the place, under or overexposing things to look okay in camera, but not so good in the editing room later. Shooting in auto leaves you at the mercy of your camera, and this will not get you to pro status very fast. As a professional, you want full control of how you are lighting your subject, but also how you're capturing that image. So in this lesson, we'll be going over how your camera even works, giving you a better understanding of how to use it, allowing you to flip through your camera settings like it's second nature. This is an exposure triangle, and it displays the three primary settings in your camera. First, we have our aperture. Aperture is the opening in a lens through which light passes to enter the camera. Think of aperture like an eye. When it's dark, your pupil opens to let more light in, and when it's bright, your pupil gets smaller to let less light in. This is exactly what your camera does as well, and this is measured by what's called f-stop or focal stop. You can control aperture by using one of these dials, or you could use the touchscreen. Now, the more light you let in, the lower your f-stop is, and this creates a shallow depth of field, which makes your subject in focus and everything else blurry. So if you do portraits like I do, you would want a lower f-stop like 2.0, 2.5, so that you get a nice blurry background and your subject is in focus. But if you go too low, like 1.4, while being too close to your subject, their eyes will be in focus, but their nose and ears won't be. So full disclosure, I personally really like close-up portraits rather than full body portraits. So I actually like to shoot around 1.8 or 2.0 to really get their eyes in focus and kind of blur out everything else. It's very stylized. For a professional headshot, I would probably shoot around 3.0 just to keep everything in focus so that there's no problems there. But if you're looking for a little bit more style to smooth out those cheeks and the ears and everything else you don't really want, then 1.8 works really well to give you a stylized image. But you gotta know that it's going to give you smooth cheeks and it's not gonna have that same texture that 3.0 would or 2.0. It is important to keep in mind when you're shooting with multiple people, you have to bump up that aperture to at least 4.0. And if you're shooting a landscape, you would want to use a much higher f-stop like f22. I would also use a narrow aperture like f11 for product photography to make sure everything is in focus, like their label and the actual product all around. Unless my goal is to just have a small portion of the scene in focus. You'll notice as you change your aperture, the brightness changes as well. So if you're shooting in low light, you can shoot with a lower f-stop to let more light in when you need it. Just know that you're gonna have a shallower depth of field. Okay, I think you get it. We'll move on. Next we have our shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long your shutter is open, letting light in the camera, and how fast your camera captures an image, and this is measured by fractions of 1 second. This is key to taking crisp and clean images every time, especially if you're taking photographs of people that won't stay still. Or even if your hands shake a little bit, you'll want to be somewhere above 1/25th of a second. Any lower than that, then you're probably gonna have a slightly blurry image and you won't be able to tell until you're in the editing room. It'll look crisp on the camera LCD screen, but it is not. You can also control shutter speed using one of these dials or on the touch screen. If you're capturing a moving subject and you want them to be sharp, you would use a faster shutter speed like 1,000th of a second or 2,500th of a second to capture it very quickly. Or if you'd want to capture a moving object like water and make it flowy and smooth, you would want to use a slower shutter speed between 1/25th of a second all the way down to a few seconds. For this to be accomplished in daylight, you'll need a ND filter to manually block out light before it even makes it to your camera, since you're letting so much more light in with that slower shutter speed. You can use the same method for capturing stars at night, but you obviously would not need to block out any of that light, so you would not need an ND filter. But when you are doing long exposure shots of any kind, it's very important to use a tripod. Otherwise, your stunning image will just look like a bunch of blurs on the screen. The last part of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is your camera sensor's light sensitivity and is pretty simple. The lower your ISO is, the cleaner your image will be, but it also will be darker. So if you are in a low light situation and you want to keep your aperture and shutter speed where they are, you will have to bump up your ISO, and the higher your ISO goes up, the more noise you will get in your image. And I'll just say this is a huge red flag for amateur photography work, so it's important that you light your subject well, or if you're on the go, use aperture and shutter speed to their fullest potential to brighten the image, then shoot with your ISO a little bit higher to compensate for the rest. So unless you like the look of an old staticky TV, then the goal is to shoot with the lowest ISO possible. If you're thinking by now, hey, ISO doesn't stand for light sensitivity, that doesn't make any sense for an abbreviation, you'd be correct. ISO sensitivity is a standard set by the International Organization for Standardization. Weird, right? Yeah. I have the ISO function set to the little touch slider on the USR, but it will probably just be another one of your dials, or if you have a RF mount lens, you can use the little dial on the lens, or as always, you can just use the LCD screen to control this function. Now you know the exposure triangle and how to use it to get the specific professional shot that you want. Using these settings fluently takes time and practice, of course, but once you do, they become second nature and you won't even notice changing them on the go. It's just gonna happen on its own. You're gonna be sitting there and you're gonna be changing camera settings and be like, I don't even know what I'm doing right now. But there is still lots to learn, so let's hop into the next lesson on camera settings.